I'm Schlappe and I'd like to present my master research. How can effects, sound manipulation, looping and visual elements contribute to a strong double bass solo performance, and what elements of the outcome can be integrated in free contexts and in possible collaborations? One of many great things I've learned in the last 2 years here in Maastricht is that the answer to why we do what we do is the most interesting part. So why did I choose looping and effects as a research topic? Technology has always been something which inspired and fascinated me. Since I started to make music, I was fond of effect pedals and music technology in general. Looping was one technique in particular. When I started my masters and thought about what to research, the COVID pandemic was in full swing. I knew it would be difficult to start a new band and bring them all to Maastricht. So I thought, what if I am the band alone? I had some experience with loopers and effects, but they were quite unsatisfying. So what if I developed a perfect looping machine and used my crush on pedals to make it sound more interesting? But I want to go a step further and combine this with visual projections, which are informed by my setup. My concept is that the visual projection is not programmed in advance. Instead, it is generated and reacts to my performance through algorithms within predefined parameters. And this way, it would be possible to use existing gear in concert venues. Methodology. I approached this research with an action-driven methodology. I designed my desired outcome and tried to find ways to realize them. I ran into various dead ends and began all over again. This is how I tackled the subtopics. Looping. Research what was and is there. What is missing? What do I want and what do I need in a looping machine? Start building one designed to my own needs. Subtopic 2. Sound manipulation. Explore different combinations of effects, natural sounds and extended playing techniques. Try different orders of pedals. Record improvisations and reflect on the outcome. Improvisational context. Dismantle the complexity and transform into an intuitive handling. Improvise with the rig, different people and reflect which aspects can be improved or where barriers are lying. Visuals. Research how to provide usable data and find somebody who can generate art with it. In hindsight, there were basically 2 stages alternating. Phase 1. Researching, implementing ideas, programming and testing. Phase 2. Making music with it, being creative and gathering ideas. Part 1. The quest for the perfect looper. First of all, there is no such thing as the perfect looper, but there is a perfect looper for me and a perfect looper for you. And they are most likely very different. But first, let me tell you about my history of looping. When I started my looping experiments in the early 2000s, I used simple stompbox loopers. They were fine when playing alone, but often I tried to use it in a band for looping a bass line and then playing sorts of guitar stuff on top of it. It was almost impossible to get it lining up to the rest of the band. And in 2003, I found a looper unit called Repeater from the company Electrics. This one had all the features I was longing for. 4 independent tracks, an effect send and return, and MIDI sync. In my graduation concert in 2004, I did my solo performance with this unit. Back then, it was acclaimed as the best looper unit of all times. Actually, the story could end here, but here comes the sad part. Unfortunately, it broke after a short time. The company was out of business and the product discontinued. That was in 2005. When I started my master study in Maastricht, I rediscovered my interest in technology and looping. I wanted to explore the possibilities of 2020s in regards of live looping, and to develop a one-man show setup due to the COVID pandemic seemed logical to me as well. What attributes does my perfect looper have to have? Of course, looper units became much more sophisticated and developed over the last 15 years, but still, they all lack an important aspect for me. Flexible audio routing, multi-track output, effect send and return loops, not to speak of quantization and different loop lengths. I'm working with Ableton Live since 2003. There are so many aspects why Ableton could be the core of a perfect looping machine. It is designed to work with loops in a totally different way compared to other DAWs. It is extremely stable and designed for live performance. It has the ability to connect to remote hardware like launchpads to control all sorts of functionality. It can handle both MIDI and audio signals. It is capable of complex audio and MIDI routings, and it has built-in effects optimized for live performance. And last but not least, with Max DSP integrated, you have got an incredible powerful platform for custom effects and tools of all kind. In a perfect looping machine, I want possibilities like different loop lengths, pitch shifting of individual loops, independent effects for each loop, quantization of recorded material. First steps with Bing Looper. At the beginning of my masters, I vaguely knew what I wanted to research. Something with live looping and effects, I said. Luckily, at this early stage, Matthias told me about Bing Beats. Frank Wink is a Dutch producer, multi-instrumentalist and composer living in Utrecht. He started a series called Beats Unraveled in 2013, where he reconstructs iconic beats. It became successful, but he did not want to build a career on beat covers and abandoned this concept. He took a year off and developed his own music. Although it is based on loops, he did not want to simply stack layers upon layers. He was longing for song structures that include stopping of loops and restarting them at a later point. But he ran into the problem that Ableton is not able to do that natively. He developed a Max for Live device which controls aspects of Ableton Live's track controls like arming, recording, stopping, playing and quantization of clips. And with this device he could implement complex song structures. Ableton published a video of him where he explains his setup and how it works. When I saw this video, I was absolutely thrilled. This was exactly what I was looking for. With the Bing Looper device, I developed a bass version of an old song, Mo Better Blues. It took about 2 weeks of work to get the script programming right, and still I had to record about 18 takes until I had a version which was okay. I often pressed the next scene button a beat too early or too late, which resulted in total chaos. Some scenes were 36 bars of recording long. Sometimes something went wrong, and because all the parameters are well hidden deep down in envelope curves, it took sometimes hours to find the mistake. I had also problems with the CPU power, although I was not using many effects. Monitoring through Ableton Live was not reliable and the latency was bothering me as well. I thought it might not be the right approach because when I wanted to improvise with my setup it would become very complex very quickly. But this was something I really wanted. I wanted to explore sound manipulation. It wasn't suitable for my workflow neither. I wanted to record and loop in a more spontaneous way. I think Bing Looper works so well for Frank because he uses mainly the natural sounds of many different instruments and effects only lightly. His tracks are perfectly planned, arranged and rehearsed in advance, whereas in my case I have the same instrument all of the time and use external gear to manipulate my sound. I want to have access to looping parameters on the fly and be spontaneous. Bing Looper was a great start and experiment, but I needed more control over Ableton in a customized way. Then I found CliffX Pro. Improvisation is a very important aspect of my musical identity. Being flexible, spontaneous and fast with my looping setup was a key ingredient. I need the operation to be low threshold and intuitive. Funny enough, it was this Bing Looper tutorial of Conor Shafran where I found about CliffX Pro. He mentioned it in the comments. This software is so powerful and gives me everything I need to bend Ableton Live to my needs. It became the centerpiece of my setup and still has a steep learning curve. CliffX Pro was developed by Sam Stray-Hurley and is a control surface script. It is not bound to one specific piece of hardware though. It can be controlled from different sources with little commands such as, for instance, metro for turning on or off the internal metronome, or BPM to set the tempo of the project, which you simply write in a clip's name. You can control and access everything which is controllable via the Ableton Live API or LOM, without diving into Python programming. It is possible to program any MIDI controller to do almost every command or action. Some of this is possible with the built-in mapping function of Ableton Live, but you would have to remap everything every time you start a new project. Furthermore, CliffX Pro, you can combine different pieces of hardware to interact, and best of all, you can even add a custom Python code to extend your needs of control. The quickest way to explain what CliffX can do is by showing what it does in my set. So I have a launchpad here, which I customized, and I have those 8 buttons represent 8 loop tracks. Those 4 represent drum tracks. These are momentarily resample, like freeze stuff. They are not labeled yet because they're fresh since last week. There are other buttons which shift the functionality or add functionality to those different tracks. The most obvious one is probably the play button. Now, if I hold down the play button, it goes into the play mode. There's a functionality in CliffX Pro which is called X mode, which can shift the functionality for a trigger. Like each of these buttons is defined as a trigger to trigger an action which is then done in Ableton. Now, if I hold down the play button and I press 1, it starts whatever is in slot 1 on track 1. I prepared a loop, and then I have other tracks. With mute, I can mute stuff momentarily by just going pressing down, and if I let go, they start playing again. This is especially useful when you have a beat and you want to have a variations. Okay, and this is done also by a functionality in CliffX Pro which is called G control. So you can define different actions applied to different events. You have an event if you press down, and you have an event when you release the button. This is how I do this mute button. If I press down, it gets muted. If I let go, it unmutes. Okay. Now I have a variation of this loop in track 1 in slot 2. Now to start that, I select slot 2 and then press play. And there's the variation. Another great feature in CliffX Pro are bindings. To give you an example, I start a loop. This one in track 2. Those 8 buttons represent the 8 loop tracks. So to go to loop track 2, I press the second button. Now it's connected to the second one. And now I want to send it, for example, to the delay. I simply turn up the knob, and I can do stuff with the delay or with the reverb, which was not turned on. And so on. I mean, you can do pretty much everything. To point out one aspect, and that is variables. What I can do with this, I have a command to record a loop. Record on track 1, 4 bars in slot X. And then what I do is I just define the variable, how many bars, by pressing this button. And this button literally just says recording length is 4. This one says slot is in 3. And now I can say I want the first loop record in track 6. And then I can trigger on my foot controller the recording process. And then it starts in slot 4. 4 bars of recording. Another great thing about G controls, you can control not only an event for press and release, you can also define when you hold down. So you have a command if you press something for a longer time and when you release it after a longer time, or if you release it immediately. So when I press and hold down, it switches to the alternative variable, which is 5. So this is slot 5, and to reflect that, it blinks, it flickers. I can have a representation of the parameters sent by my setup via Wi-Fi to my iPad or to any other destination. What is the matrix? It is indeed a philosophy how many pedals to use and in which order to put them. After my first experiments with Blink Looper and the gear I had, I knew that with CliffX Pro I could build a powerful machine. I went all in. I cancelled retirement savings and bought a bunch of pedals. What's the point of getting old without pedals to play with anyway? I had the idea of a rig where I could effortlessly change the order of effects, do parallel processing or even do feedback loops. To be perfect, it would be possible to control this programmed or automated. I knew that there were no hardware solutions for such a task in existence, at least at that time. There are some hardware solutions out there which do matrix mixing. For example, a company from Norway, Pladask Elektrisk, has a very interesting device called Matrice, a 4x4 analog matrix mixer. With this unit you could connect 3 pedals and send anything anywhere you want. This is just a 4x4 matrix. One input and output is needed for the in and out, so you could connect only 3 pedals and only in mono. And there is no possibility to control anything via MIDI. After it became clear to me that there is no easy hardware solution, I thought about possible software-based solution. There's Ableton and I already used it for my scripted looping. Inside Ableton I had individual inputs and outputs for each pedal. With the software monitoring activated, I now could send any signal to any pedal. But it was confusing, hard to control and to stay top of things. And then there were other problems too. Latency and CPU overload. This solution over Ableton had one major problem. If I go through the audio engine of Ableton, there will be a noticeable latency, about 14 milliseconds minimum. And this adds up each time I go from one pedal to the other. Going only through 2 pedals adds up to 84 milliseconds. Latencies greater than 15 milliseconds are noticeable for listeners, especially when you are also the player. But the latency was not even the real problem here. With each audio input monitoring activated, I put a serious amount of work to the CPU, which resulted in permanent CPU overloads and audio dropouts. Of course, the problem of latency is not new to the world of audio recording and processing. There's a technology called direct monitoring, which is a shortcut on the signal path before any DAW processing in the computer directly inside the interface. On some audio interfaces it is done by an analog signal path fed directly back into the monitor. No latency, no CPU strain. I finally took a closer look at RME interfaces, which have a stellar reputation in regards to reliability and quality. It comes with a mixer software called Total Mix, which is packed with features. It claimed that it could be controlled remotely via MIDI. I was intrigued, and after some more research I bought an RME Fireface 802 and another DAAD converter additional to the one I already had. I now had 30 analog inputs and outputs plus zero latency mixing software fully controllable via MIDI. 2 questions came up. How do I implement the operation on a piece of hardware, and how do I manage to implement the control? Hardware controller. I had a Novation Launchpad Mini MK1 available. It is a hardware controller with an 8x8 pad surface. My first version of my matrix was straightforward. Each row represents an output and each column represents an input. For example, to send input 4, the 856 stellar session, to destination 6, the hologram, I would press button 20. The LED of the button would light up, and to clear this route I would simply press it again. The upside of this solution was that I have a direct visualization of what is going where. But it turned out to be much more complicated to realize. With an 8x8 matrix I am limited to 7 effect chains. 1 is for representation as an input, but I was planning with 11 effect chains. The output would have been elegantly represented by the middle buttons, where source and destinations meet. It was also not possible to get the launchpad in a simple node toggle behavior, nor could I get the visual feedback to work. I got a Mark III later where that was no problem, but at that time I already advanced to another concept. For a 12x12 matrix I would need a bigger hardware controller with 12x12 buttons. I did some research and found possible controllers, but they were boutique and custom-made, therefore very expensive, so I abandoned this path. After some rethinking, I came up with a possible solution. I used one button for each source and one button representing each possible destination. For 11 effects and one input and output, this would be 24 buttons in total, and this fits perfect into 3 rows on a launchpad. To assign a route, I press and hold down the desired destination and then press a source to turn on the connection. Although I have future plans to add features, this concept turned out to be very effective, intuitive and relatively easy to implement thanks to the architecture of RME Total Mix. The realization of my idea of a flexible mixer matrix was very intense, but I am confident that it works rock solid and can be developed even further. The possibility to combine external effects and control the signal flow from Ableton pre-scripted are endless. Thanks to the stability of RME Total Mix, my setup is reliable and responsive. It feels like an instrument. Every time I start making music with it, I feel satisfied because it is just a millisecond from that moment of, how would this sound if I send this there and then back to this pedal, to its realization. It was worth all the effort and I do not regret having chosen the red pill. Part 2. Making music. Sound manipulation and sounds of the double bass. Pedalosophy. Why so many pedals? When I play the bass, I'm often focused on intonation, timing, or using the right technique. This comes from my classical training where the focus lies on the mistakes, with the goal to improve, of course. But this is the conditioning which keeps me sometimes away from getting into a creative and playful flow. When I use pedals and move my focus towards them, I'm a child again playing with his favorite toys and forget about the world. This is the mindset which is great for creativity. I like to think about effect pedals as an extension of my instrument and toolkit for musical expressions. It does not replace any of traditional ways of expression. Pedals inspire me. The feel of twisting knobs is something which triggers that play instinct. It is a direct link of cause and result. It is an omnidirectional process. Playing the instrument, pedal modulating the sound and creativity, influencing each other in a triangle. I want to give you some examples what I can do with these lovely effects. First, pitch shifting. I have a loop here, which are upper harmonics and nothing special really. But I use this to generate chords with the H9 from Eventide. There are some artifacts in the upper register, and I use a filter from a modular system to filter those out, and then maybe some reverb. Does it sound wonderful? As the second example, I've prepared a loop. And I will send it into this lovely unit from Chase Bliss Audio. It's called Mood. And it's a granular micro looper and does cool stuff. Some kind of reverse delay effect. And it's bound to a clock, so you can pitch shifted. Morning jams. I started a series called Morning Jams. The idea was to jam every morning with my rig and record this with a multicam video and audio setup. Although everything was ready built, it took 15 to 20 minutes of turning everything on, checking if everything works, etc. Unfortunately, I underestimated the time it takes to handle the massive amount of data and editing the material afterwards. 20 minutes of making music resulted in 150 gigabytes of video data, and the copying process alone took 15 minutes. To get 2 minutes of edited material, it was a half day of work. I quit doing this on a regular basis, and I switched to do my jams as audio only. I had a coaching session with Markus Birkler, and he showed me a great way to use delay and reverb. He uses a volume pedal after a split signal to control the volume what goes into the delay and reverb. And with a long decay and feedback I could freeze sounds, and you hear the result in the morning jam I did after this session. Doing morning jams was great, but I knew I had to take a turn and work on more structured form sooner or later. The whole point of building this complex setup as accessible as possible was to be able to script a looping performance. But it turned out to be much more challenging than expected. The setup had become too complex and I ran into various dead ends and conflicts. The first song I did a script for was Escargot de l'Espace, where I first did an arrangement and then translated this into sequencing scenes to control the recording process. Collaboration and improvisational context. I think of my rig more as an instrument than a pure effect unit. My approach for building this rig was the possibility to play with it and with other musicians. Together with Julia Warren, a fantastic musician and improviser, we booked a day in the studio of the Conservatory Maastricht. The plan was to have Julia playing into the rig, me looping her and reacting towards both ways. Of course, I also played some bass, but in this setting I could concentrate on being a knob twister or sound manipulator. This was also a test how well the setup is built to take on the road. A whole show of a guy playing double bass is quite likely a little bit boring, at least visually. Right from the beginning I had the idea to control visual elements with my setup. The whole programming of the setup itself took so much time I realized at an early stage I won't be able to do this on my own alone. Luckily, I met Tom Luyten, a visual artist and teacher at the ZUYD University of Applied Science. I told him about my ideas and he agreed to work with me for my graduation concert, and I am beyond happy that he will be part of the show. Concept. I imagine visuals which are generated from my audio signals. I have them separated in my computer. Tom works in the field of computer-generated art, but to generate art you need data. I thought of ways how I could provide him data of my setup he could work with. Possible sources of data from audio tracks: note pitches, velocity and frequency spectrum. I found plugins which are free and analyze audio data to transform them in OSC. This data can then be sent over Wi-Fi to Tom and he will feed this data into his system to generate visuals. We had a recent test to see if it works and it did work right away. A short update. The live visuals won't happen. Very unfortunately, Tom is confronted with a private situation which he has to take care of and he can't be with me at my concert. Conclusion. It feels much more like a milestone than a finished work where I am now. I did not imagine I would start to program in a proper language like Python. I can recall a conversation I had with Laurent Peckels at the beginning of our studies in Maastricht when we talked about my project. He said, "It could be very useful if you do some programming in Python," and I replied, "I will never, ever start to program in Python for my setup, because if I do so, I'll open Pandora's box and I won't have enough time to use my setup and make great music with it." Well, I did open Pandora's box wide open and I spent uncountable hours to get my ideas formed into working code. Before I started to make music, I programmed software at the age of 11 and I remember it as a rewarding and deeply satisfying process. Back then, I spent a whole week in front of a monitor and if my mother had not provided regular meals, I would have starved a great deal. If I encounter a technical problem, the curiosity to find a solution is very powerful in me. It has been a driving force for me ever since. And this has led to many great solutions, and my setup is working in a way I would have never imagined. The possibilities and stability at the same time is most satisfying. That being said, I have not spent enough time to make music with it in relation to how much time I spent developing it. I would estimate 1 part making music to 7 parts programming. That is why it feels much more like the beginning of a project rather than a point to write a conclusion. The good thing is, the real fun part lies ahead of me. When playing and experimenting with my setup, it is easy to get lost for hours just jamming and making soundscapes. At some point, I had to force myself to forget about all the future plans to improve and reprogram and work just with what I got. That worked great when I did so. Choices and limits. I learned about the beauty and effectiveness of setting limits. In many conversations I had with Matthias, Scott Harper or Markus Böckle, it was a recurring motive that I should limit down my possibilities to give my creativity an appropriate room to unfold. It lies in my character to look first at all the possibilities and collect them. It is an acquired competence to set limits. That does not happen naturally or instinctively in my case. In regards to my development as an artist, this technique is the most helpful and effective I learned about in the last 2 years. It helps to focus on the music. I think I read somewhere that our brain is not capable to process more than 3 parameters simultaneously, and it definitely works best when focusing on only one thing. Side effects and future plans. The world of pedals is a small one when you put the few big brands aside. There are vast numbers of small companies that build the quaintest pedals. I was able to make connections with some companies and the people behind them. It feels like a familiar community. I became a beta tester for 3 Degrees Audio. Or I did an interview with Scott Harper, the brain behind the YouTube channel Knobs and the co-author of the book Pedal Crush. I also became an alpha tester for the new version of CliffX Pro, which works with Ableton Live 11. Reflection. I am very satisfied of how far I've come, and I am thrilled to see where it will go. I had few occasions to test my setup in a setting where I improvise freely with it. Due to the open concept and flexibility of Ableton Live and CliffX Pro, it is easy and fast to integrate and realize new ideas. Ableton Live is designed to connect to other software, so the idea to integrate my setup into an existing band which also has Ableton Live is relatively seamless. Just recently, I got selected for an artist residency at the Rock Hall in Luxembourg for a project of the sonification of data with Dr. Valerie Vermeulen, with a big concert on the 3rd of December. Thank you very much for your attention and have a great day. Okay, what is happening? And this is the sign that the bread in the oven is ready. So I see you in a bit.